In just 3 days, on Saturday, November 23rd, I'll be hosting a virtual convergence titled Roots of Resilience, an online gathering for cultivating depth and vitality in a time of uncertainty. It will be starting at 10 a.m. Central Standard Guatemalan time, featuring inspiring speakers such as Manda Scott, Seth Kaufman, Elena Natalia, and Oak Mountain, all of which are former guests of this project and whose insightful conversations you can revisit in the show archives. This gathering promises to be grounding, enriching, and transformative. And it's also a fundraiser to launch a scholarship fund for individuals facing financial barriers to accessing alternative and holistic health services, including the threshold counseling that I offer. For the final stretch of ticket sales, we're offering a special 2-for-1 deal, which is an incredible opportunity to share this experience with a friend or loved one, and a meaningful way to gift someone a chance to deep dive into the topic of resilience while contributing to this grassroots initiative. And a recording will be available with every ticket purchase, so even if you can't attend live, you won't miss a moment. And if you just want to review it or view it at your own pace, in your own space, in your own way, then this recording makes that possible. So please join us as we dive into the vital topic of resilience and support expanded access to holistic health services. If you have any questions or wish to donate directly to the fund, feel free to email me using the address in the show notes. Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for heartfelt conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I'm your host, Tay Tayari, and today's guest is Simon Yugler. With a master's in depth psychology, Simon is an internationally experienced psychedelic therapist, educator, and the author of the book Psychedelics and the Soul, a mythic guide to psychedelic healing, depth psychology, and cultural repair, which is the very topic of this interview. And I have to say that I think this book is absolutely essential for anyone who has had experience with psychedelics or is interested in experiencing psychedelics, and especially anyone who is facilitating or has an aim to facilitate in the future. I'll say it again, I think this book is absolutely essential, and it is so well written. I've read many hundreds of books in my life, and Simon really is skillful in being able to draw you into the story and keep you engaged and really bend your mind and open your heart in ways that allow access to deeper aspects of self and soul, in my opinion. So go buy the book, check it out, and I'm sure at the end of this conversation you'll be even more curious. Simon has also taught for 5 psychedelic training programs, including Naropa University and Inner Trek, and he draws on his diverse experience learning from indigenous cultures from around the world. And prior to becoming a therapist, he served as an experiential educator, leading immersive study abroad journeys for young adults across 10 countries. Based in the Pacific Northwest, he is passionate about helping his clients navigate the liminal wilds of the soul. In this episode, Simon and I explore the evolving so-called psychedelic renaissance and the soul-revealing potential of these sacred medicines. We discuss the need for respect, reverence, and an initiatory approach, cautioning against reducing psychedelics to mere mental health tools within a business-as-usual mindset. Simon reflects on some of his personal journey, growing up in the US and sensing a profound soullessness in the culture, and how psychedelics eventually played a key role in helping him access soul, confront grief and shadow, and tap into deeper layers of the mythic. Together we delve into the complexity and necessity for cultural repair, the aliveness of myth, and how psychedelics can spark collective transformation and rekindle our kinship with the more than human. So, this conversation encourages reflection on soul, land, culture, and the mythic, embracing grief as a necessary element of culture making and awakening a reciprocal, animistic consciousness that is deeply embedded and entwined with our wild world. If you're new to the show, you might like to know that I'm a counseling psychologist with an online practice dedicated to supporting wanderers, and edgewalkers. If you're curious about how my personalized individual and couples threshold counseling could benefit you, I invite you to schedule a free insight call. This is a great opportunity for us to connect, explore our alignment, and see if we're a good fit to walk alongside each other during a pivotal time in your life. To learn more about my approach to counseling, including the guiding themes of the threshold work that I offer, and to schedule your free insight call, visit coyotecouncil.earth. There's a direct link in the show notes. And for more content, including additional podcast episodes and my latest essays, follow the same link. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe to Wild Heart Revival on your favorite podcast platform. Your likes, comments, ratings, and shares are not only deeply appreciated, but essential for nurturing the organic growth of these heartfelt conversations and stories. Now, let's humbly wade out into the mythic and soulful together as we welcome today's guest, Simon Yugler. All right. So, as I was mentioning before we started the recording, I have nothing but immense praise for the book that you wrote, Psychedelics and the Soul. And I'll talk more about that in the intro because I really want to just dive in. As I was mentioning as well, I kind of over prepared and I have a lot of questions and they're all really exciting to me. So we'll leave the intro for me, letting everyone know how essential I think this read is. And I hope people appreciate that we just dive in. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Let's do it.
So you write that psychedelic literally means soul revealing, a necessary distinction that sets our compass squarely in the direction of this inner domain. And so I'm wondering how modern practitioners and participants in the so-called psychedelic renaissance might align their work so that it actively orients toward soul.
That's a great question, Tay. Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is to not relate to psychedelics as sort of inanimate molecules that we can sort of extract our antidepressant hit from so that we can kind of move on with our lives and continue being good little workers and good little capitalists and make things sort of okay or acceptable that maybe to the soul's point of view are completely unacceptable. And to essentially extract the soul out of psychedelic by making it into a exclusively as a tool for mental health and productivity and sort of what James Hillman calls day world solutions, kind of these solutions to our problems that don't actually involve descending or that don't actually involve the soul in any meaningful way, but instead just sort of keep us blissfully on the surface and going on with business as usual.
Yeah, there's so many little threads there to pull on, some of which I think we'll get into later on. But I want to ask you, obviously you realize, it probably wasn't one moment in time, but you realized at some point, at some juncture in your life, that there was either some significant degree of soullessness in the psychedelic movement of the West, of modernity, or that there was a risk of soullessness taking root, for lack of a better term. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's hard to identify kind of
Yeah.
when that realization kicked in. I think for maybe people listening can kind of relate to the experience of being a young person in school and sort of looking around and kind of realizing like this is all wrong. Like this is all like what is this? What
Mm-hmm.
is this sort of um, system we're in as children? What is this sort of society kind of that we're in? Growing up in the 90s, right, as like a solid millennial, it's kind of like was this sort of peak area of like American, blissful opulence and naivete.
Mm.
And then, that illusion kind of got shattered, but just sort of um, waking up to the just heap of unmetabolized grief that
Yeah.
seems to be kind of just seething beneath our culture. And I think the word grief really kind of came at a later stage.
Mm-hmm.
As a teenager, it showed up for me more as anger.
Same.
Right, for many young men, right, rightfully so. There's a
Yeah.
lot to be angry about, but they like to say that anger is just sad's bodyguard, right? So
Mm. Yeah.
um I think the more I kind of matured with that realization that something just wasn't really right here, that anger kind of cooled and sort of solidified into grief.
Yeah. Yeah. A deeper inquiry, a
Mm,
slowing down, because that kind of anger can be kind of fast paced, and seeking for some kind of answer or solution, try to grip some kind of answer or solution, force one. And it's through the slowing down and the contemplation and the inquiry that soul has, where you start to kind of sync up and syncopate with the pace of soul, which seems to be much slower than our
mm,
ego pace.
mhm,
So, yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing a bit of context around that. So, you mentioned early on in the book that psychedelics are, I think I'm going to say this right, abreactives. Am I
mhm.
saying- Yeah.
Yeah.
Psychedelics are abreactives, meaning that they bring to our conscious awareness whatever unconscious material has the most unconscious energy around it. And so I'm wondering, I'm sure we all are, how can we cultivate a more resilient readiness to engage with this kind of unpredictable material that might arise from the unconscious, especially when it forces us to confront difficult and oftentimes hidden truths about
Mhm.
ourselves and the world?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think what we're talking about is shadow,
Mhm.
just another word for shadow. And um, going back to your first question, Tay, it's like to think that psychedelic experiences are just going to sort of like can like help us in this sort of linear fashion, just sort of strengthen our
Mm,
ego and belief systems, like isn't actually how it goes, at least in my experience. And so almost to sort of prepare for a confrontation with the unconscious, as Carl Jung called
mm,
his sort of descent to soul, which lasted like 13 or 14 years. Jung was just consumed by his own psychic material and
mm,
shadow and everything. So if Jung can do it for 13 years, surely we can do it, for 5 hours in a little psychedelic assisted therapy session, right? It's like,
mm,
um, yeah, I don't know how people can easily prepare other than taking care of your kind of foundation, right? Taking care of your
Yeah.
basic needs beforehand, taking care of the foundation and the trust and the safety that you have with whoever person or group
Mm.
or retreat center that you're kind of doing this medicine with, taking care of these foundations to ensure that there is like adequate space for whatever that material, um, you know, whatever that material is, that there's spaciousness and a landing pad, so that kind of goes into the notion of preparation and
Mhm.
integration too, but that's not like the be all end all either, because even that is like assuming that we know, how a certain experience is going to go or how a medicine is going to behave. It's
Right.
like, oh, just integrate enough or just prepare enough, and not even that,
Yeah.
not even that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think that you'd be wise to seek out other soulful endeavors before turning to an experience with an abreactive substance that you can't really know how it's going to go. Are there more approachable soulful experiences where there might be a little bit more certainty or control or something? What comes up for you when I say that?
yeah, I think breath work is a great um,
Yeah.
sort of contained experience of the unconscious, you
Mm.
know, um, other kinds of, I don't know, inner forms of inner work, right?
Mm.
I've never gone to a Vipassana retreat, like a 10-day retreat, because I'm terrified. I'm terrified of what that 10
Intense.
days
Very intense,
would
brother.
be like, so intense. But something like that, just sitting in a quiet
Yeah.
room for 10 days.
That's a really good point. Yeah, of Vipassana or meditation retreat. Where like the thing with Vipassana is it's at least one that I experienced in Cambodia is it's very strict, you know. And psychedelic experiences are strict in a sense because you're just in it, you can't really escape it.
Hmm.
And Vipassana is like that as well. Like you're just here. I mean, you can leave, but they're kind of wanting
You
you
don't
not.
really want to.
Yeah, yeah,
It'd
yeah.
be a really bad move to leave.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I remember planning my escape on like day 6 or 7, trying to figure out how I was going to get out of there, which was just a defense mechanism of the ego trying to hold back from what was inevitably arising from those depths from sitting for so many hours. So, yeah, that's a really, really good point. Okay, so you state that myths are alive. You say you take a step toward a story and it will take a step toward you in return. And so in our postmodern era that often feels dramatically disconnected from the mythic, how might we authentically rekindle a meaningful relationship with myth and mythological mindedness?
Mm, that's a beautiful question.
Mm.
I don't want to pretend to sort of like have the answers, but what the first thing that comes to me, is just to take that very question onto the earth and
Mm.
take it onto the land and
Mm.
see what happens, because it's something I don't write about much in my book, but something I'm very interested in is sort of the embedded nature of mythology and landscapes, and how, I've heard it said that, myth is the earth telling itself its own story through human beings. And so if we want to connect to that kind of mythic realm in some regard, yeah, absolutely. Like read Joseph Campbell, read, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, all that is great. And take that longing and that curiosity and that desire onto the land itself, because that's where these stories emerge from, and are held, is in the earth. And to pay attention, to sort of try to see in a new way. Martin Shaw talks a lot about seeing versus beholding. and kind of beholding as this way of perception that kind of makes space, let's say, for that mythic or animate intelligence to kind of reveal itself before you. And you'll be surprised, things happen out there in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think oftentimes things happen and people might turn away from it or brush it away as irrelevant or irrational or something like that. Like if they receive some kind of message or intuitive deep feeling, some kind of feeling that's laden with meaning, but it's their sense is that it came from the river. But our Western colonized minds will go, oh, that's just my imagination, making things up, moving on to my next thoughts that I'm controlling or think that I'm controlling. Do you get what I'm saying? Like there's this kind of de-armoring, I think, that's necessary in order to relax the heavy filtration system that our colonized mind has when we are with the land, in
Mm,
order to be able to actually receive deep meaning from the natural upwellings of sensory experience and imagery and so on and so forth.
mhm. Yeah, and what you're saying, it reminds me of also kind of when I do IFS work or like
Mm,
active imagination work with people or dream work with people, where it's like we have to sort of trust the psyche and sort of take the psyche at its word. And especially with kind of these inner forms of therapy or inner work like IFS or active imagination, it's like first thought, best thought. Like what comes to mind is what comes to mind. Just like what reveals itself out on the land is what reveals itself.
mhm,
And to like see that almost as like an oracular happening that we can imbue meaning with or not, right? And then we get to watch all of our parts or all of our sort of ego trips try to do what it does with whatever occurs in the psyche or out in nature.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, how might you respond to someone who kind of pushes back on that and says, well, if my imagination or my first thoughts that are arising are unhelpful, so-called automatic thoughts, how might you begin to kind of disentangle that for someone?
Hmm. I mean, if we're going to go down the IFS road or internal family systems road,
Mhm.
that's just what that part has to say. And
Yeah,
it probably has a lot more to say. And
yeah,
there's probably an origin story as
yeah.
to why that part has to say that particular thing. And there's
Mhm.
probably like a really explicit job or function that that part plays. And that part also probably thinks that, you're a certain way and that you need to be protected or
Mhm.
treated in this certain way or that the world is, it's a story basically. So
Mhm.
like that thought in itself has a sort of mythological story going on too,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and it's not like separate from the conversation.
yeah. Yeah, well said. Yeah, I've had a client recently that was really getting hung up on these automatic thoughts, he was labeling them, that kept coming up. And he was kind of skirting around it for a while, wouldn't even really share with me what it was, and I respected that. And at some point I just said, well, have you just slowed down and listened to what it's really saying? And I just saw something click in him of like, oh yeah, because it was this because of this kind of pop psychology idea that the automatic thoughts are bad, I
Right.
need to push them away, right? Bad versus good, rather than it's just material and how you relate to it.
It's kind of
Do
like no, this is the wrong tarot card. It's like
right,
you pulled the wrong tarot card. It's like, no, this is the card. This is what
right,
it is. I'm sorry you don't like it, or it's not what it's not like the magical, like over the top thing that we're expecting, but like this is the card, or like
yeah,
this is the thought, or this is what happened, you know.
mhm,
And again, it's like trusting that intelligence, I guess, in that moment will be a mirror in some way, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, let's talk about the great below, the underworld a little bit. You describe the call to the depths of the psyche as a profound knowing that beckons us to the great below. And so I wonder, how might you characterize this call? Is it something we can resist, or does it demand our immersion as part of contacting the deep self?
Hmm. Well, it's interesting, you know, most people these days are familiar with the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell's work around that. And the first thing that happens in the hero's journey is that there's a call. There's a call to adventure, which is what Campbell calls it. And then the second thing that happens, which is really interesting, is that there's often a refusal of the call. And I've seen so many people, dear friends, you know, a lot of people, clients, etc., kind of get stuck in the call and the refusal, and the call and the refusal, and
Mm-hmm.
and waste years just in that first little zone, you
Yeah.
know. And I'm not like the biggest hero's journey fan. Like, I've written about my problems with it and all of that, but it is interesting that there is a call and there is often a refusal. And that experience can kind of be an underworld in itself, almost like a frozen place. That's a hell realm right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like a paralysis hell realm,
Mm.
um, that you can't get out of. Whereas to, I think, you know, do the harder work of buying the plane ticket or going on the road trip or, you know, doing the thing that you know you need to do, even though, you know, you have a million reasons why it might not work out. That has like so much more meaning that can be created out of it rather than this sort of stuck hell realm of the call and the refusal. And I think I'm just speaking to that, one, because it's just top of mind,
Mm.
but two, because, you know, it seems to be, I think, in terms of like looking at what so many people seem to be struggling with in our culture today, especially men, because most of the people I work with as clients are men. So much of it almost comes down to that kind of call and the refusal. And it's like the call to initiation and then the sort of culturally programmed refusal of that initiatory step, which
Mm.
creates the conditions for, like, you name it, whatever, depression, anxiety, addiction, you know, hopelessness, all this epidemic of mental health, as we call it, you know, I think can be viewed through so many different lenses of perception. And
Mm.
for men, you know, there's a strong case to be made, I think, that we have, like, it's not just a crisis of mental health or a crisis of meaning, but it's a crisis of initiation,
Yeah.
because men have that call and then they refuse it. And that
Yeah.
might go on their entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, there's a couple of thoughts here for me. I wonder if there's something intelligent in that refusal, and I'm going to
Mm,
talk about that in a couple different ways, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. First, that seems just blatantly evident and obvious, is that we don't have the psychosocial structures, psycho-spiritual social structures to plug into uh, for initiation, right? We're not an initiation culture. And so that refusal cycle, the call refusal cycle, I wonder if there's a part of the deep self that knows that it's like extra dangerous or something these days because of the lack of real depth of holding and cultural roots, you know? Um,
yes.
but because the man maybe doesn't know how to even think about it, isn't even thinking about it at all, or if he is, maybe doesn't have the right kind of pathways to explore, maybe he can't see it in that way. And so it just kind of perpetuates rather than being able to zoom out a little bit and go, well, what's missing that's causing me to cycle like this?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the one thing. You want to say something there?
Yeah. I mean, just something you said really struck a chord, like the notion of like having the proper amount of holding in the culture, right, as necessary for initiation to take place, or these big life steps to take place, is so right on. Like here in the States, like we don't even have healthcare, right? Like people, their basic needs are so kind of not taken care of. Like I noticed when I was in Canada, like must have been like a year and a half ago or something.
Oh, yeah.
And
Where were
just
you?
meeting. I was up on Vancouver Island for Martin Shaw was in Canada,
Yeah.
and I went to a bunch of his events and sort of hopped on Martin tour for about a week with my
Oh,
friends who were organizing it.
yeah.
And
Mackenzie and them.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Ian and Tad Hargrave and that whole crew.
Yeah.
Um,
Cool.
and I noticed like there was a sense of, maybe it was my projection, my sort of American onto Canadian projection, but it was like a sense of people being more relaxed and willing around things like having children or kind of these bigger life steps, because like in Canada, at least, there's like several more notches on the stick of like, we're going to be taken care of. Not much, but like enough to do things like take these big steps. Where in the States, I see so much more hesitancy and fear because people actually don't have any support. Yeah.
I was blown away when I went and looked into how much it costs on average to have a child in the United States. Blown away, dude. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, folks can go look into that. It's mind bending and heart wrenching. So yeah, I mean, that's a good example. And there's so much more there, right? I mean, that's just kind of like basic biological safety. And then there's the lack of like cultural depth and so on and so forth. But I wanted to say one more thing about that. It's something I
Please.
learned recently that was really cool and striking. I'm sure most of us know about the metaphor and the reality of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. The caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, gets violently turned to goo. Amidst that violence, there's these what scientists call imaginal cells that come online that were dormant before, and those imaginal cells steer the soup into some kind of meaningful reconfiguration, which we now know as a beautiful butterfly. So there's that incredible story. And what I learned recently is that there's something interesting that happens as the caterpillar is being turned to goo. And that is that it has this major spike in immune response. So the immune cells of the caterpillar actually come on like full force to resist the dying and the change. And so scientists were like, well, why is that happening? You'd think that it's going to happen anyways. Wouldn't it just like surrender, right? And so they looked into why that might be happening. And the idea is that they found out that that amount of resistance is proportional to the health and vitality of the transfiguration that occurs. So there's something essential about the actual resistance to change, death, and transformation that strengthens the creative capacity for that transformation to come to fruition. What do you think about that?
I love it. I think it's like there's so much precedent in nature for that, and even the butterfly coming out of the chrysalis, right, needs to emerge on its own to get the strength in its wings to break through that chrysalis. Whereas if you were to cut it open, it wouldn't be able to fly because it wouldn't have had that resistance,
Right.
to break out of. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, it speaks to the nature of initiation, which is like consciously inflicted suffering,
Mm-hmm.
doing hard things on purpose.
Mhm.
And, a lot of native cultures have really preserved that in their ceremonies, like the Sundance or even just an Inipi ceremony is like
Mhm.
hard, and there's a purpose of that hardness, of that difficulty. Um, yeah.
Which is very evident and obvious for folks once they actually engage in a ritual like that,
Mm,
From the outside, a sweat lodge ceremony might seem like I've even told people about it, and they've been like, I would never do that. Really? Just like hot heat, sweat, and naked in the dirt with a bunch of people in the dark? Like, what? But you go through it and you come out of that dark, moist, hot womb, and there is a rebirth of some sorts. Not to be dramatic, but sometimes it can feel quite dramatic depending on how deep you were able to, access. So, yeah, I guess the practice of it, which is easier when it's imbued in the culture.
yeah. 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 And just to sort of tie this up
Yeah.
with, some of your first questions, like, I think if psychedelics are not approached in this way, we're in serious trouble, because then they're just play toys, and then they're just medications, and then they're just sort of this like Huxleyan soma or opiate, maybe. I have a friend who's very, very skeptical of ketamine, the ketamine industry, and
Mm,
why ketamine is allowed and encouraged, but not these other compounds and medicines.
yeah.
So unless, I think, and this is my biased approach, right? This is not dogma or ultimate truth. This is how I view things. Unless we bring that framing of initiatory process and rites of passage and ceremony and ritual and all these things we've been talking about to the work, to psychedelic healing work, we run the risk of just kind of repeating more of the same and more of the same and more of the same, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the orientation and approach that really, really matters. And that's not just intention. It's not just saying a little intention before you take the mushroom. It's like a full body, ensouled movement in a direction that is aimed at the best possible outcome given what you know about yourself in this kind of process. And like the ketamine example is a great example because I've seen so many folks abusing ketamine. And what I mean by abuse is just like really overdoing it and doing it in contexts that are like base, babes, butts, like the sacred is just very, if you're going to touch it, it's like in the cracks, in the corners of those spaces. And, but the thing is ketamine can be really, really potent for initiatory process.
For sure.
Yeah. Like
I've accessed underworld
yeah,
spaces with ketamine almost, I don't want to say like in a deeper way, but in a very scary way, more
yeah,
so than ayahuasca or any other medicine.
me too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Ketamine in a float tank will,
scary.
oh
It'll turn
yeah.
you into a prehistoric ape, right?
Yeah.
According to altered states. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and so it's very, very powerful. So to me, yeah, again, just to emphasize this approach, the orientation, and I think that any approach worth its salt is an approach that is completely imbued with reverence and respect. And reverence and respect usually is very much tied in with protocol,
Hmm.
especially, culturally speaking. Um, Yeah, if you want to say anything on that, I'll let you. Otherwise, I'd love to bring in another question.
I think you nailed it, man. I think you nailed it.
Okay. Thanks. All right. So I want to talk about the serpent a little bit.
Mm.
You say that the serpent is an ancient symbol of earth, the body, and the shadow, what could be understood as the unholy trinity. I forget who coined that term. Maybe you can let us know. But I'm wondering, how do you see the serpent as a guide in your own journey toward integrating body, psyche, and shadow?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I've worn this serpent ring here for many, many years, and it's interesting that that particular chapter is about the body, which is I think this almost kind of like uncharted territory in psychedelic studies is like how psychedelics actually work in the body. We
Mhm.
don't actually know.
Yeah.
We have a vague idea of mechanisms of action in the brain and some kind of anecdotal evidence of like, yeah, like sometimes you'll get cold or like sometimes you'll have tremors, right? But we don't really know why. So
Mm.
there's this like mysterious undercurrent, often in my experience, that happens through the body. And to
Mhm.
me, I've just related to it over the years as like this writhing serpent, that is reflected in so many world mythologies, whether if it's the Kundalini serpents, up the spine in the yogic tradition, or down in the Amazon, they have this idea of Sachamama, or the Shipibo have this idea of the cosmic snake as well, kind of like this undulating cosmic serpentine force.
Mm.
And it's so common across cultures. Plato, in one of his dialogues called the Timaeus, wrote about the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, as sort of the container holding the universe. Like that's the universe is inside this Ouroboros snake. It just goes on and on. Like name a culture, and there is a myth about a snake.
Mm.
So one, they're just these profoundly archetypal animals that hold up really potent mirrors to the human psyche. And I think we can go all the way back and like think about, our fear of snakes as a species and our fascination with their actual biological habits and patterns, right? But their prevalence in myth is just so hard to ignore.
Mm.
And yeah, I think they can be allies as well. And I just read in a book that at the in Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, which was the Oracle of Apollo, there was a giant serpent buried underneath the ground, and they believed that the oracle incantations that would emerge into the priestesses were actually sort of emanations from the intelligence of the snake, which is like the shadow side of Apollo. So there's this whole
Mhm.
sort of like sun and moon thing, they're just these beautiful animals that I think have been the repository of our collective shadow for millennia, and just are worthy of our respect.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that the way in which they so beautifully show the necessity of shedding skins, which of course we do too. It's just not in such a dramatic way as them. I mean, physiologically, we're shedding our skin all the time, but the symbolic depth of that, of this need to consistently be shedding layers of whatever we have building up over top of our true self, our authentic self, over our soul, all the various psychosocial, cultural layers that we take on. And they remind us, like, are you shedding? Are you remembering to shed? And I love the story that you bring in that
Mm,
chapter, and that image of the rawness that can be underneath the shedding,
mhm.
and that rawness and that vulnerability is really important at certain junctures in our own journey of knowing ourselves.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Okay, so let's talk about inner authority and communal validation. I thought that you wrote to this so potently, in whatever chapter that was, there was a focus on that. And I have a quote here where you say, "Power in an integrated initiatory context is achieved through authentically earning it, a task that is recognized, facilitated, and therefore trusted by the community. You also mentioned that the authentic power is inherently relational and therefore must be in service to the very relationships that support it. So in today's commodified psychedelic and spiritual landscape where self-proclaimed authorities abound amidst withered cultural roots, how can we orient or reorient our values toward a soulful balance of inner authority and communal validation? And how does this balance shape truly life-centric leadership?
Wow. I'm just sitting with the complexities of that question, and don't even know how I would begin to answer it, to be honest,
Yeah, it's always just a play, what was that thing you said earlier? First thing to come to mind?
First thought, best thought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
first best thought.
Yeah, I mean, the word leadership is what comes to mind, and what that really means, and yeah, it's strange, there's I feel like our culture, doesn't have a lot of structures for helping us understand good leadership, and especially in a psychedelic context where everything is amplified. If psychedelics are even remotely involved, things are going to be magnified and amplified. So it means that any fragments or cracks or disharmonies within leadership are going to play out in a big way. And I've seen that happen in many regards, sometimes to disastrous outcomes. Tay, like the simplest way I can really answer that question, because I don't know, but like the simplest thing I can say is just that everyone needs to be doing their own work. And if that's not a part of kind of the top, let's say, then everything's going to reflect that lack of reflection. So yeah, that's the simplest way I can put it. And having a relationship to I would say having a relationship to the people in your care, and I'm speaking directly to leaders right now, having a relationship to the people in your care that is actively trying to dismantle the structures and problems that got us into this mess in the first place, where we need psychedelic therapy to bring that understanding and history into your own leadership and the way that you create the culture in your organization and how you do what you do. Meaning, it's the same idea of like, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right? It's like the things that got us here aren't going to help us get out of here. And I feel that way in leadership, in a big way. Everything from sort of top-down corporate structures to, ways that people just relate to each other. And yeah, to me, it all comes down to kind of doing the work itself.
Yeah. Relationality is key. It's central, which makes me think about humility. I wonder if you have any reflections to share, since you're so involved in a certain area of the psychedelic movement in the United States and Oregon, but also kind of globally. You're in Jamaica and whatnot, and you're connected, So I imagine you've seen a lot in the way in which people show up in leadership. I'm not asking you to single anyone out, but are there any reflections around the themes in which you've witnessed that are concerning to you, and how important, how do you see humility as being some kind of antidote to the challenges faced in that way?
Well, I mean, I think psychedelics are like essentially humbling, right? So if there is a, like let's say a lack of humility or something, it's only a matter of time before the medicine in some way brings a serious dose of humility.
Mm,
Even if it's not being consumed all the time, like the
mm,
medicine will move things.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, but you
so
also talk about in the book how it's not like just because you take psychedelics doesn't mean that it's going to make you a better person, you know? If you're a narcissistic kind of dominating person, it might actually strengthen whatever
right,
those
it might make it worse.
like this idea, give Trump some mushrooms and
Right,
everything will be different.
right.
Like, I just don't know if that's the case. I don't
Oh,
know.
fully disagree.
Right.
Fully
Okay.
disagree. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
there is a lot of evidence that psychedelics sort of enhance narcissism and bolster the beliefs and stories that are already kind of propping it up, So yeah, I don't know, man. I don't have like a toolkit for dismantling narcissistic power structures, but it's more of like, to me, like the only thing I can do is to sort of look at, try to do the work of looking at what are the cultural conditions that got us here, which to me is like a lack of an initiatory culture where there's sort of a um, let's say communally approved notion that like, okay, you've earned this now, you've earned
mm,
this. Not everyone gets a trophy, not
mm,
everyone is suited for particular roles, you
yeah,
know so I don't have an answer, but more just looking at noticing what we've lost,
yeah.
as a way of taking stock of where we are.
Hmm.
That's
And
about
that's
all I can do.
yeah, yeah, thanks. And it's such an important emphasis to place on like communal recognition. And like, are there folks looking to you, not because you placed yourself in some kind of position for them to look up to you, but are they looking to you and raising you up as a community because they recognize that you hold some kind of particular value in this sort of a leadership role? Um, because I've seen a lot of folks take on leadership roles in various kind of new age spiritual groups, including psychedelic oriented groups, that I see as an outsider, just like, whoa, seems kind of cult like in the way that that's happening. And it seems imbalanced, like this inherent relationality that's needed within a life centric leadership role seems to be really out of balance. And so I imagine that in those situations, oftentimes those people kind of assumed a leadership role rather than had it bestowed upon them. And I think that that happens particularly in communities that are like transient and nomadic,
Hmm.
because you have more room to just kind of pretend to be someone because there's not really accountability, I guess, is
Yes.
that's what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or something that I write about a little bit in that in the book and in that chapter is like um sort of uh psychedelic facilitators or quote shamans, right, who kind of maybe get a bad rap in a certain town or place. After a
Mm-hmm.
few years, word gets out, they've hurt a few people, they've made some mistakes. They don't take accountability. What do? They just pull up stakes and
Pack up.
they pack up
Yeah.
and leave town. And it's like, it's so like traveling sideshow. Like it's
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
in fact, the word charlatan actually comes from an itinerant trader in the Middle Ages who would sort of talk a good game about whatever like snake oil or like magical potion they were trying to sell, So
Yeah.
like travel is an inherent part of the word of charlatan.
Mm, very interesting reflection point on that for sure. Yeah. All right. You also write that, quote, psychedelics are medicines of reconnection. They may be able to shepherd us back toward recognizing that all beings are indeed our kin. And you also mention that a defining condition of modernity is our unraveled kinship with the natural world. So how do you see psychedelic experiences having the capacity for fostering a shift in consciousness that helps us recognize our interbeing with the wild world? And what role might grief also play in this kind of sacred reweaving?
Yeah, that's a topic that I think could be like a whole other book in itself,
Yeah.
and again, I don't pretend to have the answers. I'm, at least me, I'm still like sitting with the loss,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I don't want to move too quickly to sort of prescribe how psychedelics should be used to like rekindle a sort of animist perception, even though that is my wish, right? If I could wave a magic wand, that would be my wish. One of
Mm-hmm.
many. But it is interesting, though, I will say on the flip side, that there is research starting to come out, some of which I share in the book in that chapter, that actually documents and makes a strong case for this kind of animist perception or an animistic consciousness being ascribed to non-human matter, plants, stones, waterfalls, post psychedelic journey. And, in that chapter, I talk about Roland Griffiths, who, was probably the most important psilocybin researcher in the 21st century. 3 months before he died at the Psychedelic Science Conference in 2023, highlighted that study as one of his sort of parting words to the culture of like, hey, this is actually maybe right now the deepest and most important application of these medicines is reconnecting to our planet. Helping depression and anxiety, that's great. That's wonderful. I almost look at that as like a bonus to reconnecting to our earth.
And how connected are those? The
And how
depression.
connected are those?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure you know the Emerald podcast. I think you mentioned
Of
it in
course.
the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's incredible. He has that classic one. Animism is normative consciousness.
Yes.
And I was reminded of that as you were speaking there and thinking about this topic. And I was also reminded about Stephen Buhner and his work. You know much about him?
Yeah. Plant intelligence.
Yeah.
The natural world. Yeah.
Yeah. And have you read how he talks about psychedelics?
No, I haven't.
Okay. It might be in the big one he wrote called Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realms.
Right.
Gaia or something. And I think he talks about psychedelics there, and he labels them as serotonergic neuronostics. And he kind of gets into this inquiry, this spiritual scientific inquiry around how psychedelics are connected to this serotonergic functioning in our bodies, in our being, but not just our bodies and our being, all bodies and beings through the whole web of life. And that psychedelics that share that serotonergic link, that he suggests that a big part of the reason why they're here, their ecological functioning, has to do with opening up our serotonergic functionings and pathways, and opening up what he calls our sensory gating channels in order to allow more kind of raw data or information to be welcomed into our body, to be able to generate myth, story, meaning within ourselves in relation to this bigger bulk of information that's always here anyway. Anyway, I probably butchered that, dude, but I just wanted to mention.
No, that's amazing. I need to read that book. Yeah, I have a friend who
Yeah.
teaches some of his work, and
Mm,
I should look into it. But yeah, I've known about his work for a long time,
yeah,
and yeah, you're really selling it right now. So you
cool.
need
I
to read
highly
that book. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 please do. I think it'll be really supportive because that's always my inquiry, like how how do things relate back to the ecological? How do things relate back to the web of life and
Yeah.
earth? Because everything that we know is related to the life force that is earth. Everything we know emanates out of earthly patterns and flows and forces that are all woven into this story of continuing life, keeping the biosphere alive. I
Hmm.
think it's that kind of simple. And then, of course, we're embedded in a solar system and it goes up and out in a holonic structure. But anyway, so I always wonder in my own ways, especially when I am experiencing psychedelic medicine, of the kind of ecological tendrils that might be present or what's happening in that ecological consciousness way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, you're kind of gesturing towards the third element in the subtitle of the book, which is cultural repair, which
Mm,
is what I get into the least in the book, and
mm,
what I find myself more and more caring about the most.
mm,
And it's almost like, there's a lot of fascination with psychedelics kind of as the end goal, or as like the thing in itself.
mm,
And I don't think they are the thing in itself, right? The earth is the thing in itself. And for us humans, culture is the thing in itself. So there's these kind of two um, foundational elements to
mm,
being a human being
mm,
that I do believe psychedelics are re-emerging in this way to help us reconnect to and heal our relationship with the earth and our kind of wider culture and communities. You know, um, if I might be so bold as to suggest that, I don't know. There's a lot of people who would say that that's just like a totally biased sort of
mm.
trajectory of thinking, but
Do you feel that in the
I'm sticking with it. So
Yeah, yeah, because I feel that too, man. Like I really have a strong sense the more that the days of my life flow by, that the plant nations of Earth are calling us back to Earth, calling us back into the ground, into ancestry, into roots, into mycelial meanderings and wanderings and sharing and it's just that psychedelics are like the most kind of potent, like jarring experiences, but there's also very subtle things that can happen with plant allyship as well, you know. I just think that the kind of overculture is so hardened and rigid in its orientation and ethos that the power and potency of psychedelics might be kind of the way in which to like begin to break up that armoring in a significant enough way.
yeah, sometimes you need a jackhammer,
Yeah,
sometimes you need several jackhammerings
yeah,
to get to soil,
yeah, yeah, for sure. So you also write that vision requires us to be in reciprocity with the powers of the other world if we want the blessings of these experiences to actually stay with us. So how do you see the role of reciprocity in ensuring that the blessings of visionary experiences not only stay with us, but continue to evolve and nourish us? And
Hmm.
is there any personal experience or observation that might highlight the importance of this reciprocal relationship with the other world in the context of psychedelics?
Yeah, Martin Prechtel talks about how kind of the two unique gifts that human beings were given were our opposable thumbs in order to make things, and our tongues in order to sort of speak. And with both our thumbs and our tongues, there's a sort of utilitarian value, but there's also a poetic, artistic value, which is registered in as beauty, you know? So it's
Mm,
this idea of like creating beauty
mhm,
is kind of the agreement, right?
mm,
Or the deal, let's say.
mm,
And I like to entertain this idea of like, yeah, there's a deal with the other world too, of, you know, Alex Gray wrote about how like when he would come back from any visionary experience, he would do a little drawing or maybe make a whole painting, you know, based on that, just as a way to sort of create beauty out of that experience, as a way
mm,
of honoring it, you know. And for me, I had to write a whole book. Like
mm,
that's part of what, you know, drove that um
mm,
expression, and will continue to do so,
mm,
because that's what I can do, you
mm,
know. And so you know, Martine writes so much more eloquently about this than I ever could, but it's this sense that like deep, deep, deep down, you know, in our kind of deep ancestry and DNA, our ancestors somewhere along the line understood this agreement,
mm,
this notion of creating beauty, speaking beauty into the world,
mm,
making what we now call art as a way to sort of feed the holy, which is the wording that Martine uses, you know,
mm,
to feed the holy.
mhm. I love that. Yeah, it's really quite disheartening in some moments to see the colonial extractive ethos be overlaid onto the so-called psychedelic renaissance. Not that I don't know if it's totally dominant in that way, but it's very evident that plays a role. And I often wonder when we hear about, ayahuasca vines and peyote buttons and these medicines and the frogs and things being decimated like all other resources um, in this kind of extractive culture. It does make me wonder how we can all orient toward that law of reciprocity better, and what the hurdles are to really get there in that way. It's feels complex and kind of big and confusing at times.
Mm.
It's a
Yeah,
really
money's a big one.
yeah, yeah.
Money's a big one. Yeah. I mean, just the convergence of, we don't need to talk about this too long, but just the convergence of psychedelics and capitalism are like these two words that like shouldn't be in the same sentence, like military intelligence or the music business. It's like,
Mhm,
yeah,
mhm,
they exist.
mhm,
Psychedelic capitalism exists, but these are sort of oxymoronic
mhm,
ideas that we're putting together, you know.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, well said. Okay, we have a few more minutes. I have two more questions, so hopefully we can get both of them in here. Um, you ask, kind of near the end of the book, you ask, what does it mean when there is no village to return to, no elders to sing one back into the fold? Which makes me wonder how to rebuild community structures in order to soulfully support those returning from transformative journeys.
If I knew, I would tell you.
Yeah, yeah,
If
yeah.
I knew,
But
I would tell you. Yeah.
what's your sense? Because you spend a lot of time in integration work and in these communities where people are going through these transformational processes. So there must be some sense of threads to pull on for you in terms of really having some kind of structure for people to be folded back in, as you say in the book.
Yeah, well, you know, sometimes people are folded back in and sometimes they're folded out,
Mm,
meaning that sometimes people realize that they have to leave the situation that they're in,
mm,
or
yeah.
that they've been living in a way that is actually no longer true for
Mhm,
them. So sometimes that happens, you
mm,
know. Look, I mean, it would be just so lovely if like all of us could live in little like towns that had a yoga studio and like the communal market, and like everyone's on land, and like there's children, and like everyone has their needs met, right? And people can do ceremony together and all these things. I mean, that's the dream.
Mm,
And at least for me, that's the dream.
me too.
Um,
Yeah.
but you know, I'm also just sitting with like the utopian nature of that idea. And I think I'm just finding myself less and less feeling like certain of any
Mm, mm,
solutions. You know, I'm like, especially here in the U.S. I don't know if news got down to Guatemala, but we just had an election, you know,
mhm,
here
mhm,
that didn't go so well for a lot of us.
mhm,
But the to me, like it's um, there's kind of a pervading sense of like um, dissolution, I
mm,
think, happening.
mhm.
And yeah, you know, I don't want to be so sort of naive to say that we all just need to like live on land and trip together and like grow food. Like, yeah, of course, you know, and um, there are, I think, deeper problems that are still unraveling that no one is safe from. You
Mhm.
know, that's a little bit of a doom and gloom kind of answer. So, you know,
It's
but
real, man. It's
yeah,
honest.
it's more, I don't know. It's like Joanna Macy has this notion in her work, in the work that reconnects, of like sitting with the grief and kind of like honoring that in community.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's the only thing that comes to mind, you know, at least right now. I hope
Yeah.
that changes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was hearing, and the way you're unraveling that is that it seems to be mostly just about the inquiry and the quality of curiosity, the quality of aspects of being that can hold grief within ourselves and others, compassion, real empathy. Um, like you were mentioning earlier in the conversation, that it's this inner work process. Um, so the more that we can go deeper into ourselves, which also is a relational practice, right? Then we'll be able to hold each other and ourselves through these transformative processes, hopefully better over time, even in the face of great uncertainty. Um, and I think that there also needs to be a letting go of some kind of prophesied vision of everything working out the way that we hope. And I love how Bayo Komalafe says that hope is a trickster.
Hmm.
Hope encompasses, includes, integrates hopelessness. So,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting just thinking about like community building. And to me, I like to orient more towards this idea of culture making. And I don't pretend to know how exactly to do that. But to me, that seems more and more to be um, what is called for.
mhm,
And again, it's like the third part of the subtitle of my book is cultural repair.
mhm.
And it's there's a whole lot more there, let's say. Maybe
Yeah,
it's the next book. I don't know. Um,
I would love that. I hope
yeah,
so.
yeah, me too. um, but yeah, these are big questions, Tay.
They
You
are.
know, these are
They
big
are.
questions, and they're good questions, you know. And it's just interesting to me that these questions, just like the very fact that we're getting to these questions by talking about psychedelics, is like interesting in and of itself.
I was
Um,
just thinking that, like, for those listening, expecting Simon or me to have answers to these big questions. And by the way, thank you for being willing to just like sit in the trenches of these questions with me. But expecting an answer is not the right way, I don't think, right? It's just being in the inquiry together. And if there's little threads that come up naturally, then pull on them and see where that goes. And, eventually, hopefully we'll all have enough threads to be able to weave something meaningful and resilient and rooted and lasting over time. So, yeah. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. So it's right at the end of the book. You're talking about basically embracing incompleteness in the healing process. And you beautifully state that, quote, healing is a process of wrestling with our incompleteness until we find the blessings therein. So how might this shift in perspective change the way we approach psychedelic experience and or integration, especially in a world that's very obviously focused on completeness, wholeness?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, having worked at psychedelic retreat centers and things like that, where people are spending a lot of money and sometimes flying from really far away to come get their, 3 doses of whatever. There's a lot riding on that. There's a lot riding on those 3 doses and that one plant, or fungi in that case. And, there's a lot of expectation of like how it's going to be, how it's going to look on the other side of this. And it's usually good, but it's usually not what people expect. Yeah, I mean, I think something that I've kind of heard from clients and people that I've worked with over the years again and again, that I'm kind of just now like beginning to unravel is this idea where people, not always, but often enough to notice it, people come to the conclusion that their work with psychedelics just isn't this one-time thing that's going to sort of fix their issue in a linear way. But people, I've heard people say this in various ways, and usually it comes out to something like this. They say, I feel like I need to make this a part of my life. Or I feel like this is like a life path now. Or I feel like this is actually asking me to like integrate this kind of work into my life in a way that I wasn't thinking about before. And yeah, I think that's really important and valuable because it takes some of the pressure off, at least for the medicine and for you to kind of like get it all done at once, Like, have you ever heard someone, and like maybe setting an intention, maybe in a ceremony, and they're like, I want to find my life partner and clarify my career and figure out where I want to live and like fix my car and like all these things. Like, that's a lot to put on ayahuasca for one night, it's probably not going to all get done. And all of the trauma healing isn't probably going to all get done in,
and whatever does get done is probably going to get done in a very different way than you ever expected.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So again, it kind of coming back to where we started, it's like trying to take these medicines, like removing them a little bit from this conversation of mental health and like linear improvement and bringing it into a sort of different orbit of conversation that is, I would say, more circular and orbital rather than like this linear trajectory of constant healing and improvement.
Yeah, I love how Tyson Yunkaporta talks about how Indigenous folks in Australia and probably around the world, they don't even have an understanding of linearity. And so even the concept of non-linearity isn't a thing, right? It's about the winding, wandering path of life that sometimes spirals and circles about itself. Eventually it has some kind of destination, but that destination is a death that leads into the next round of the whole wide circle anyway. So, yeah. All right, brother. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Really appreciate you making this happen. And it was such a blessing to read your book. And I encourage everyone to read this if they have any interest in psychedelic experiences, medicine spaces, so on and so forth, especially facilitation. If that's any kind of inkling, that this book I feel is essential. So thank you for your work and your effort and the heart and soul that you very evidently put into it, and into whatever else you're up to these days. And yeah, just much gratitude, man, really.
Thank you, Tay. Yeah, thanks so much. I love this conversation.
Me too. Me too. Cool.